It was Halloween, and everything about that night seemed to whisper caution. Maybe it was the way the wind howled through the bare branches of the trees, or how the moon seemed to hide behind swift, dark clouds, only occasionally casting a pale light over our small town. I was 13, teetering on the edge of outgrowing trick-or-treating, but my little brother, Lucas, was only 8, and clung to the tradition with fervent delight. I was tasked with guiding him through our familiar neighborhood, his hand in mine as he skipped in his dragon costume, a makeshift tail swishing behind him. We made our way down the bustling streets, filled with children darting like fireflies between houses. Laughter floated in the crisp air, and every so often, a scream from a particularly effective jump scare followed by giggles filled the night. It was all normal, comforting even, until Lucas, his bag half full of sweets, tugged me toward Old Brook Lane. "Let's go there," he said, pointing with his chubby, gloved finger toward the street that curved away from the heart of our neighborhood celebrations. Old Brook Lane was different. The houses were spread farther apart, their lights dimmer, their decorations sparse. "I don't know, Lucas," I hesitated, eying the darkened path that led up the lane. "Mom said to stay where the streetlights are bright." "But just one house, please," he begged, his wide, hopeful eyes breaking my resolve. "Okay, one house," I agreed reluctantly. We walked up the lane, our footsteps echoing in the unusual silence. The farther we went, the fewer trick-or-treaters we saw, until it was just us, our breath visible in the chilly air. Finally, Lucas stopped in front of a house that stood back from the road, shrouded by large, looming trees. Its porch light was on, a lone beacon in the darkness, and shadows moved behind heavy curtains. "Here!" Lucas exclaimed, rushing up the path. I followed, a knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how isolated we felt. As Lucas rang the bell, I stayed a few steps behind, my senses heightened. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a man in his 60s, his hair disheveled, his clothes slightly rumpled. He didn't smile, his expression unreadable as he looked down at Lucas. "Trick or treat." Lucas's voice was cheerful, oblivious to the tension. The man's eyes flicked to me, then back to Lucas. He reached behind the door and produced 2 candy bars, dropping them into Lucas's bag. His movements were slow, deliberate. "Thank you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Something about him made me uneasy.
"Why don't you come in for a minute? Warm up?"
he offered, stepping aside as if to welcome us into his home. I tightened my grip on Lucas's shoulder. "No, thank you. We need to get back to our mom," I said quickly. He studied us for a moment longer, then nodded.
"Very well. Be safe."
We turned to leave, but as we walked down the path, I heard the door close softly behind us, and an inexplicable shiver ran down my spine. I urged Lucas to hurry, and we didn't stop until we reached the brighter, more populated streets. Breathing a sigh of relief, I tried to shake off the eerie feeling as we resumed our trick-or-treating, but the night had lost its charm. After a short while, I suggested we head home. Lucas, surprisingly, didn't protest. Later, as I lay in bed, the events at Old Brook Lane replayed in my mind. Sleep eluded me, my thoughts a tangled mess. I couldn't explain why the man made me so uneasy, why every instinct had screamed to get away. I resolved to avoid Old Brook Lane next Halloween, vowing never to let curiosity overrule caution again. 2 days later, our small town was shaken by the news. The man from the house had been arrested. I overheard my parents talking in hushed, urgent tones in the kitchen. He was a suspect in a series of break-ins around town, known for targeting homes while families were out. His method always the same: befriending, observing, then striking when least expected. Chills raced through me as I absorbed their words. The invitation into his house, his strange demeanor, the isolation, it all made a horrifying sense now. I didn't tell my parents about that night, not wanting to admit how close we'd come to real danger. But I learned a valuable lesson, one that extended beyond Halloween. Always trust your instincts, and sometimes the truest horrors are those that walk among us, masquerading as mundane. Dating apps always felt like a gamble, a roulette of profiles and pictures where everyone tried their best to impress. That night, As I swiped through Bumble, something about Mark's profile struck a chord. His bio was witty, packed with references to indie films and classic books I loved. We matched, and after a flurry of messages that flowed easily, we decided to meet. We chose the Oakwood, a cozy cafe known for its live jazz and intimate setting, the kind of place where conversations could unfold comfortably. I arrived early, nerves tingling, and found a secluded booth. When Mark walked in, he was exactly as his pictures had promised. Tall, with an easy smile, and eyes that sparkled with what I assumed was excitement.
Rebecca?
His voice was warmer than I'd imagined, and as he slid into the booth, the initial awkwardness melted away. We ordered coffee, and the chatter resumed, our topics bouncing from movies to travel to our shared love of hiking. However, as the evening progressed, I noticed subtle shifts in Mark's demeanor. His questions, initially casual and engaging, grew strangely personal. He inquired about my past relationships, my family's whereabouts, and whether I lived alone. Each question was laced with a curiosity that bordered on intrusive. "Mark, let's keep things light, okay?" I tried to steer the conversation back to safer waters. He chuckled, a sound that didn't quite reach his eyes.
Of course, I'm sorry if I'm being too forward. I'm just fascinated by you.
Despite his apology, an unease had begun to coil in my stomach. The cafe, once a comforting space, felt increasingly confining. Mark's gaze was too intense, too focused. It was when he excused himself to the restroom that I took a deep breath, trying to dismiss the creeping anxiety as first date jitters. He returned, his smile a bit too stretched.
You know, I feel like we have a connection. Don't you think we should leave this public place and go somewhere more private? I know a spot.
The suggestion sent a jolt of alarm through me. "I think I should head home, actually. It's getting late." His brow furrowed.
I thought you were enjoying our time together. Come on, I really want you to see this place.
I shook my head, reaching for my coat. "I need to go." Mark's hand shot out, gripping my wrist. His touch was cold, his grip firm.
You're not even going to give us a chance?
Panic flared, my heart thudding loudly. I pulled away, his grasp reluctantly loosening. I said no, Mark. I left money on the table and hurried out of the cafe. The cool night air was a relief as I quickened my pace. The sounds of the bustling city a stark contrast to the pounding fear. Glancing back, I saw him standing by the window, watching me leave. Once home, the safety of my apartment embraced me, but the disquiet clung like a second skin. I locked the door and checked it twice, the echoes of the night replaying in my mind, his questions, the grip on my wrist. I shuddered. Days passed, and I hoped the incident would fade into a bad memory. It didn't. Mark's messages began to fill my phone, each more insistent than the last. I blocked him, but then emails started arriving, notes left under my windshield wiper, each a reminder that he hadn't let go. One evening, as I returned from work, my neighbor intercepted me in the hallway. "Hey, Rebecca, there was a guy asking about you earlier. Tall, said he was a friend?" Ice coursed through my veins. I hadn't told Mark where I lived. How had he found me? I thanked my neighbor and hurried inside, my hands shaking as I dialed the police. They took my statement, but said little could be done beyond a warning, unless he made a direct threat. That night, I barely slept, every noise a potential harbinger of something sinister. It wasn't until I installed a new security system and got my brother to stay over a few nights that I felt a modicum of safety. Weeks turned into months, and gradually, Mark's attempts to contact me ceased. Whether it was the police warning or his own decision, I didn't care. I had begun to reclaim my peace when I read the news. A local woman had gone missing after meeting someone online. The description of the man she'd last been seen with chilled me to the bone. It was Mark, or whatever his real name was. Guilt gnawed at me as I contacted the police, sharing my experience. It was too late for her, but perhaps not for others. They caught him eventually, found her too, but it wasn't a rescue. The horror of what could have been haunts me. I no longer meet strangers from online, no matter how charming or seemingly perfect their profiles appear. That blind date, meant to be a beginning, turned into a grim lesson on the dangers lurking behind screens. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I was his first choice, or just the one that got away. The excitement had been building for months. My cousin Jake and I had planned a hunting trip into the dense Appalachian wilderness, known for its expansive forests and challenging terrains. It was more than just a hunting trip. It was a rite of passage, a test of our skills against the wild. On a foggy autumn morning, we set out with high spirits. Our backpacks were stuffed with supplies, rifles slung over our shoulders, ready to blend into the world of whispering winds and rustling leaves. Jake, with his unruly beard and keen sense of direction, was the natural leader. I, more reserved and meticulous, handled our gear and supplies. Together, we made a balanced team, each complementing the other's strengths and weaknesses. As we trekked deeper into the forest, the fog began to thicken, wrapping the woods in a ghostly veil. It dampened sounds, making our footsteps eerily silent and transforming familiar landscapes into alien terrain. Jake, ever confident, led the way with a GPS device, navigating through the opaque curtain of mist. By noon, we had spotted a couple of does, but hadn't found a good shot. Jake's patience was wearing thin. He was eager to make a significant catch. "Let's head deeper in," he suggested, gesturing to a part of the map marked with dense foliage. "Deer like to bed down there for cover." I followed him, though a sense of disorientation nagged at me. The deeper we went, the more everything seemed to look the same. Tree after tree emerged and vanished into the fog like specters. I voiced my concern, but Jake was dismissive. "The GPS knows the way back," he reassured me, his gaze glued to the glowing screen. Late in the afternoon, our patience was rewarded, or so we thought. The distinct rustle of movement through brush caught our attention. Jake signaled for quiet, and we positioned ourselves downwind, eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. The rustle came again, closer this time. I raised my rifle, sighting down the barrel, my heart pounding with adrenaline. But as the shape came into view, it wasn't a deer that emerged from the fog, but a man, disheveled and wild-eyed, stumbling through the underbrush. Instinctively, I lowered my rifle, and Jake stepped forward. "Hey, are you all right?" he called out. The man didn't stop. He didn't even seem to see us. His clothes were torn, his face smeared with mud and blood. It was clear he was in shock, his eyes wide with an unspeakable terror. "We need to help him," I said, moving to intercept the man. But as we approached, he suddenly screamed, a raw, terrifying sound that chilled the blood. "They're all dead," he shrieked, his voice hoarse with despair. "Gone! All gone!" Before we could react, he bolted, disappearing into the fog as quickly as he had appeared. Jake and I stood there, stunned. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the suffocating silence of the fog. "We go back," Jake decided after a moment, his expression grim. "Now." We turned to retrace our steps, but the fog made it impossible to tell one direction from another. Jake checked the GPS, but his brow furrowed in confusion. "It's not working," he muttered, tapping the device. "It's just showing static." Panic began to set in. The forest, once a familiar hunting ground, now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap us. Every direction looked the same, shrouded in a relentless gray. We walked, hoping to find our way by instinct, but as the light began to fade, so did our hopes. The temperature dropped, and the fog turned into a cold drizzle that soaked through our clothes. We were lost, thoroughly and utterly, in a forest that suddenly felt hostile. Night fell, and with it came the realization that we were not alone. The sound of footsteps echoed softly behind us, always just out of sight. Each time we stopped, they stopped. When we moved, they followed. Fear gripped us as we huddled together, straining to see through the impenetrable night. By morning, we were exhausted, cold, and no closer to finding our way out. It was then we stumbled upon a campsite, or what was left of it. 2 tents were shredded, belongings scattered and bloodied. It was the man's camp, the one who had run from us, and the scene confirmed his words. We didn't speak much after that. Our mission clear. We needed to survive, to get out. Not just for ourselves, but to tell what had happened here. Eventually, we found a ranger station on the edge of the park. Relief flooded through us as we recounted our tale. The rangers mobilized immediately, but what they found, or didn't find, in the fog-shrouded woods remained a mystery. Jake and I never went hunting again. The wilderness had shown us its other face, not just of natural beauty and thrill, but of unspeakable horror and loss. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still hear the echo of footsteps, a reminder of what lurks in the gray depths of the forest. Working the night shift at a small-town gas station isn't everyone's ideal job, but for me, it was a quiet place to make some money while figuring out my next steps. Most nights were uneventful, filled with cleaning duties and the occasional customer buying late-night snacks or cigarettes. Tonight felt different, right from the start. There was an unsettling chill in the air, and the usual hum of nocturnal insects was absent. I settled behind the counter, browsing through a magazine between customers. The first few hours passed by slowly, with only a couple of trucks stopping to refuel. Around 1 a.m., a man walked in. He was tall, wearing a heavy jacket despite the mild night, and his hood was pulled up, obscuring much of his face. Something about him set me on edge. He roamed the aisles, his hands deep in his pockets, occasionally glancing over at me. He didn't pick anything up. "Need any help?" I called out, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond, just kept pacing through the aisles. I shrugged it off. Maybe he was just indecisive or not in the mood to talk. After a few more minutes, he walked out, empty-handed. I watched through the window as he disappeared into the darkness of the parking lot. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. An hour slipped by, quiet and calm. I was starting to relax when the door chimed again. It was the same man. This time he walked straight to the counter, still hooded, still with his hands hidden. He didn't speak, just stared at me from beneath his hood. The silence stretched uncomfortably. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, my voice firmer now. He continued to stare a moment longer, then turned and left without a word. The bell above the door jangled mockingly as he exited. My heart raced. His behavior was bizarre, but perhaps he was just an oddball, I reasoned. Yet the unease clung to me like the night's cold. Closing time was nearing when I spotted him again. This time he was standing across the street, just within the glow of the streetlight, staring directly at the station. I locked the front door, my nerves fraying. I didn't like this. His behavior was too strange, too menacing. I decided to call the local sheriff's office. As I dialed, I kept my eyes on the figure across the street. The dispatcher promised to send a patrol car. I thanked her, ending the call just as the man began crossing the street toward the station again. He reached the door and pulled at it, finding it locked. Then, he looked up directly at me, his face finally visible from under the hood. His eyes were wild, intense, and he began pounding on the glass. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest as I shouted that the police were on their way. He didn't care. He kept pounding, his actions growing more desperate. I could see his breath fogging up the glass, his face contorted with an emotion I couldn't read. Anger, desperation, something else. Then, as suddenly as he had started, he stopped. He stood there staring at me for a long, heart-stopping moment, and then he turned and walked away, just as the sound of a siren sliced through the night air. The police arrived minutes later, but there was no sign of him. They took my statement and promised to keep an extra watch over the area. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the fear remained. I was left to wonder about his intentions, about what might have happened if he had managed to get in. Since that night, I've requested to be transferred to day shifts. The shadow of the man haunts me still, and every chime of the door makes me flinch. The long night shifts are over for me. The quiet isn't worth the terror.